very, very glad to be joined by my good friend Bob Pisapai. We have a great, great love for archaeology, which means it's a great love for the study and the analysis of the evidence, the actual scientific evidence of aspects of our faith. And I wanted to let you know that Bob, I have a great, great respect for Bob, even though myself, as a graduate of USC, he is from UCLA. If you don't know where UCLA is, it's about 10 miles northwest of USC. But he really is a good friend of mine, and I'm just glad to join him for the talk tonight. And also, we will be together on Thursday night for the talk on the catacombs. And this talk is actually going to also piggyback on my talk tomorrow night at St. Jude's on the archaeology of daily life in first century Palestine, first century Judea, first century Holy Land. As I was telling Bob the other day, that I spend a considerable amount of my day, a considerable amount of my time living in another century. I really spend, I think both of us spend our time in other centuries. And we're just really fascinated about this period of time. And this is a very, very fascinating time. And what we want to talk about is the role of women in the early church, the vast number of roles that women played in the early church, and we're going to take a little bit of a look at a subset of roles of women in the early church, and that is, what is this controversy about them, about women being deacons and having kind of holy orders in the early church? We'll take a look at that as well. So we have the vast role of women in the early church, and then the subset of institutional roles. Does that make sense? So we're going to be talking for, by the way, this is a very, very big topic. So by the time that you leave here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you will have a lot of information. So we're going to get through this whole period. We are going to take a break, a little 5-minute break, stretch break to avail yourself of the vast dinner supplies they have over here. And then we will have hopefully plenty of time for Q&A, questions and answers at the end. So you ready to begin? All right, now we're going to spend a little bit of time on the very first slide. And this is a very, very important slide. If you go home with anything tonight, this first slide is extremely important. We're going to talk about the spheres of men and women in the first century. This is across the board. Wherever you lived in the Mediterranean, these defined the roles of men and women in that first century. So you see the phrase public and private. That's the way to understand male and female roles. The male role was public, the female role was private. Now, let's look at the public side. Look at a house. I think the way to think of it is your home. Okay? Think about your house, wherever it is. Apartment, condo, house, whatever it is, that's your house. Inside the walls of that house is the private domain. Outside the walls of that house is the public domain. Is that clear? Outside public, inside private. That's what public and private mean. So outdoor, indoor. The outdoor world, the entire outdoor world, was the world of men. The entire indoor world was the world of women. Each was, now this is very, very important, each was captain of their world. You cannot think of one as being better or worse than the other. It's a 20th or 21st century hindsight or viewpoint to look back on this time and say the outdoor world was better than the indoor world. That's not the way that they thought about it at that time. We have to kind of put aside our thinking now and look at it how they look at it in those days. In those days, men were captain of the outside world, women were captain and queen of the inside world. So inside the house, the woman was queen. Outside the house, the man was king. So second thing, you see the man was out in the world, and the woman was involved in the family. The family was inside the house. Men were outside roaming around, mobile. Women were inside, stationary, inside the house. In terms of virtues, men had the virtue of courage. Why would they have the virtue of courage? Because there's bad people out there, and you got to stand up to them, and there's violent people out there, and it's tough, and you got to be courageous out there. Inside the house, it's more peaceful, and so the virtue inside the house was chastity. Outside, the world was violent. Inside, the world was peaceful. Outside, a man had to be very much self-controlled. This word obedient at the end, I actually wanted to change that at the end, but actually the woman was self-mastered inside. Okay, so you can actually put self-mastered inside for the male, outside self-mastered for the male, inside self-mastered for the woman. Does this make sense? Okay, so it's very clear. You have to understand this idea. Very, very often you hear this misnomer that men were superior, women were inferior in the ancient world. It depends on where you were. If you were outside, the man was captain. If you were inside, the woman was captain or queen, or in charge. Okay, that's a very, very important point. However, these worlds were highly prescribed, highly strict, could not be changed. It was very, very strict. So for instance, if the woman wanted to go outside, who was in charge? All right, now, one of the reasons why this happened, and you'll hear more about this tomorrow night in my talk in the archaeology of the first century, the number one value in the ancient world, the number one value more than anything else was children. Okay? Why is that? Because you passed on your inheritance to your child. Is it your child? How do you know? You know it's your child, if you're a man, because the woman never left the house. If she left the house, and she becomes pregnant, whose child is it? The most important thing is, I have this property, and how am I going to pass it on to the next generation? And I want to pass it on to my generation, or to our family's generation. Does that make sense? So this issue of controlling where women go wasn't so much, it wasn't a misogynist idea at all. It had to do with what is the authenticity of the next generation. I do not want to, the family does not want to pass their generation on, they do not want to pass their farm on to a child of uncertain origin. Think about that, a child of uncertain origin. Tomorrow night, I'm going to be talking about a child of uncertain origin. Who is that? Jesus was a child of uncertain origin. How about that? That's why that Christmas story is so powerful. And that figures directly into this whole issue of male and female roles in the ancient world. You have to know the issue of generation of the next family is unbelievably important, because you do not want to pass on your inheritance to a child who is not yours. So in the Greco-Roman world, if a woman walked out of the house, oh my God, now she's walked into the man's world. What is that world like? Violent? Warlike? Wild? Terrible. So generally, if you walked out of your house and the well for the water was over there to the right, you walked out of your house and you walked to the left, what do you think that's about? What could they be? I mean, where are you going? Are you going to someone else's house? Are you going to be with some other guy? All right? So if a woman walked out of her house, she had to go to the well, because now she's out in the world of men, and you can only go to the well. So this issue of public and private is very, very profound, and it was pervasive in the Greco-Roman world. Women were captain, in charge, on top, inside the house with the family, taking care of the kids, because the kids are the next generation, and that was the number one goal. Men were outside in the world of violence, war, battles, warfare, and all this kind of stuff. Just as a connection to the gospel, when Jesus, and by the way, the world inside the house, again, was the world of chastity, virtue, goodness, honesty, peace, all these wonderful virtues. Outside, violence, lying, cheating, stealing, all the places that men love to be. Remember the centurion and Jesus? And the centurion says, "My child is home." You know? And he says, can you cure my child? And Jesus says, "Yes." And what does the centurion say? "I am unworthy to have you come under my roof." See, I am unworthy to have you come into my home. You see, if you come into my home, I have to speak the truth to you. If you come into my home, which is the sanctuary, which is the place of the woman, which is the place of truth and honesty and justice, if you come into my home, I can't greet you there, because I am a guy who's out in the world lying, cheating, and stealing. Does that make sense? That's the meaning of that phrase. I am unworthy to have you come under my roof. See, I'm unworthy to have you come into my home. The home is the place of honesty and goodness and wonder. So that's the backstory of that really remarkable phrase that we have at every single Mass. I am unworthy to have you come. If you come under my roof, Jesus, I have to be honest with you. And you don't, and I can't even be there myself. Does this make sense? So we have these two worlds, the public and the private. This is the Greek and Roman world. And actually the entire Mediterranean world. And by the way, this world still exists today. If you want to understand what's going on in the Middle East, it still exists. I go there every year. It still exists today. Now, go ahead.
So this wasn't a feeling of trust between men and women then?
Oh, no, complete trust. Absolutely.
No, but they could not go outside the home. They weren't trusted.
Well, look, the men weren't trusted in the home. They had different worlds. Now, they completely cooperated. The men trusted the women to make a sanctuary in the home. The home was a sanctuary. And the women trusted the men to bring home the bacon. Okay? So these are two different worlds. And they're radically different. Now, this is extremely pervasive. You cannot understand. I mean, it's unbelievably how pervasive this is. It still exists to this day. This is the culture. This is the dominant culture. Now, look what happens. Jesus and the church united both worlds. This is revolutionary. This is counterintuitive. This is extraordinary. This is dynamic. This has never done before. This is revolutionary. This is the last thing, the very last thing that you would want to do if you want to make your new religion attractive. The last thing, the most incredibly last thing that you would try to do to make this new Christian religion attractive to the Greco-Roman world is to invite men to go into the home women to come out of the home. And that's exactly what Jesus and the church did. And this was completely, 100% counter-cultural.
UCLA grads always like to let the UCLA person do all the work on the first slide. So that kind of lets me off the hook for this one. As Father Dave mentioned earlier, we both have a love for archaeology. When I retired, I had a great interest in it, received a certificate, and was fortunate enough that people had faith in me to do various things throughout the states that they mentioned. And one of the more interesting ones, I was a contract archaeologist for a small company called Compass Rogues. We were up near the Magic Mountain area, and we were doing an excavation, and it was probably the greatest find that I had participated in. It was a infant Chumash child with a projectile point embedded in its chest. And the first thing you do when there is a remains, the project gets shut down because it's automatically considered a homicide, and you need to call the coroner's office. So if you're a contractor in building a development, what transpires is that project is put on hold and you lose a lot of money. But fortunately, I wasn't the person responsible for shutting down the project, so here I stand today, alive and well. To tag along on Father Dave's earlier comments about indoor and outdoor and how the woman was the captain of a ship and the male was also the captain in his realm, let me give you a few examples from Roman, Jewish, and Greek culture. The first one would be is that in the Roman world, a woman could not hold public office, a woman could not hold a title, she could not speak in public. Why? She is out of her realm. She moves from, if she was able to do that, she would move from the realm of indoor to outdoor, which was not permitted. Same was somewhat similar in the Jewish culture. If you're familiar with the Middle East, as Father Dave mentioned earlier, there are restrictions about women and who they associate with. Let me give you an example. How many of you have seen the stoning of Syria? 2. Okay. Oh, 3. Don't have eyes behind my back. Well, it's a very interesting concept because one of the other things for all 3 cultures is it was strictly taboo for a woman to be alone with a man. And if you saw the movie, The Stoning of Syria, the process of being alone with a man is reasons to expect, expect infidelity or adultery, regardless of whether it's an innocent conversation. Now, the Greeks had a very interesting thought process about women. I could cite you several examples that will shock you, but I guess the best thing I can do is to contrast the Greek culture with the Roman culture, written by a Roman historian, okay? And I choose to read it because I want it to be accurate and not miss anything, okay? And what happened is that this fellow, John Nepos, a Roman historian, was writing about and contrasting when a woman attends a dinner party in a Roman environment, it is not, which is basically inside the home, which she's mastered in her own home, versus what happens in the Greek culture. And what transpires there is that a Greek woman could never be alone in the house with a man and could never be at a dinner party with men. She had to have permission from her husband in order to participate in such functions. So what he was trying to say, John Nepos, was that the Romans were a little bit more civilized when it came to the treatment of women as opposed to the Greeks. Now, the Christian communities, you see on your screen there, the map of east to west, from Mesopotamia to Italy. And the little stars are all the Christian communities that were established within the first, I would say, 100 years, primarily through the evangelizing the apostles and their followers. The principal communities were in Rome, Philippi, Ephesus, Corinth, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. That represents approximately 90, 80 to 100 years of Christian expansion. If you jump another 67 years, which is 167 years after the death of Christ, or 200 AD, that expansion has already migrated to Gaul and Spain. So think of the phenomenal growth that the apostles and their followers, male and female, accomplished in just a short period of time. Nothing in history equals that. So we have to be very proud of the record of the spread of Christianity in the first 167 years. Now, women and the magnet of Christianity. Why would women gravitate towards Christianity? We'll tag along on Father Dave, as UCLA grads always do. The teaching of Jesus was compassionate. He wasn't like the Romans, he wasn't like the Greeks, where they were taking Christians and persecuting them or putting them in jail for nonsensical reasons. The second most important reason is women were given a seat at the table. The merging of the two worlds that Father Dave talked about is a perfect example where women could participate in ministry, as you'll see later on as we get deeper into the presentation, and actually be co-workers with male followers. There was a sharing of mutual responsibility. You will see that later on in the presentation as far as what women were doing in the early church. And I would like to take a poll at the end to ask the audience how many of you were aware of some of the points we're going to make tonight. I'm always interested in that. The other thing is that under our faith, we condemned abortion and infanticide. Let me give you an example for the Roman Empire. There's the law of the 12 tables. The fourth bronze, as it's called for the child who was deformed to be put to death. Very cruel. Christians didn't believe in killing innocent children. Marriage was sacred, as through the teachings of Jesus. Divorce was very simple in the Roman world. If a woman failed to seek permission from a husband to go outside her realm or to attend circuses or theater or the like, which she needed permission, the husband had the right to divorce her. Not so in the Catholic faith. It was all-inclusive. By the way, the photo on the screen is one of my paisans, Tintoretto. It depicts Jesus with Martha and Mary listening to his talk about faith. Now, women in the early church, what did they do? We all know they were martyrs. They were women who were dedicated to Christ, who took vows of chastity. Sound familiar further down the road? Right? Okay. Bone gatherers, rather grisly. That's what I do, bone gathering, when I'm on an excavation. House church managers, by a show of hands, how many are aware of this? Excellent. You will know before you leave this evening. Teachers. Women instructed not only other women, but also instructed their own family on faith. The perfect example of this is the grandmother and mother of Timothy. Timothy from the Gospels. They both taught Timothy his faith, and by the time they were finished with him, Paul had no reason to reject him as one of his followers. Goes back to Father Dave's comment about what women were doing inside the home. Very important. If they were Christian, they were teaching their children to become Christian. They established church communities. How many know that women were establishing church communities? A few hands, so very good. You're making it easy for me tonight. In the writings, you will find later on a term called diakonos. It means servant. And depending upon how I would say, accentuate the Greek word, and I'm not a linguist, you could make it either something that is a woman is very special, or she has some type of title or official capacity. And finally, we have widows, which is a great ambiguity, which Father Dave will pick up later on. There was a list of widows that the church used, and we're not sure, and I won't want to steal Father Dave's thunder, about the widows or whether it was an order of widows or a list of widows. Martyrs. We're going to go through this list, starting out from martyrs and finish off where the previous slide ended, which is in the widow area. Very, very important document from a letter, number 7, to Diogenetus. How they, women, are thrown to the wild beasts or suffer the sword to make them deny the Lord. Do not see that the more of them that are executed, the more the others grow in number. That was a very big key in the expansion of Christianity. No matter how much the Romans threw at us, the Christians remained faithful. Let me give you an example before I finish. Well, this is clearly not the work of men. That is the proof of God. That is the proof of his presence. Let me give you an example. I have a book at home. It's called In the Words of the Christians. These are the martyrs. In every one of the accounts that I have read thus far, they appear before a prefect. They are asked to renounce their faith, go out to the temple, and make an offering to a Roman god, and they refuse. When they refused, they were immediately taken outside and put to the sword. What I mean by that is that they were, well, practically beheaded. And in spite of that, they never wavered in their faith. They would prefer to face death. We have martyrs and virgins in the church as well. The women who dedicated themselves to chaste lives and dedicated themselves to Christ, we would call them the bride of Christ. Okay? Let's start out with, you all know a little bit about Agnes, and this is a kind of a lesson in history. 13 and 14-year-old, you have to call them women then, but I would call them girls today, were usually betrothed by that age. By the time they were 15 or 16, they may have had several children. Well, Agnes made a decision. She was going to be pure, and she was going to dedicate herself to God. She was betrothed to a fellow named Procop, and she refused to marry him because she said her bridegroom was Christ. She appeared before the prefect because that's where you normally go, because this is a violation of a marriage contract, and never wavering in her decision not to marry Procop, she was taken out and beheaded. Catherine of Alexandria, a woman who did conversions of pagans, she was asked to renounce her faith and refused. She was also offered what we would call a royal or an imperial wedding with lots of benefits. She refused. She was thrown into prison by Maximentius, the emperor. And what transpired while she was in prison, she did 200 conversions, including the wife of the emperor. Upon his return, he executed all of them. And finally, just briefly, we have a woman named Thecla, also a young woman of 13 or 14. By the way, what they all have in common is they're all saints. Thecla, young woman, also betrothed to someone. She happened to be sitting at a window when Paul arrived, probably on his first missionary journey in the town of Iconium. She heard his teachings and was immediately fascinated by his gospel teaching and the preaching of the faith, and she decided that she wasn't going to marry her beau, Thamyris, and decided to leave the area, leave her parents and everyone behind, and became what I call a neo-follower of Paul, spread her own word, founded a monastery in Seleucia, Syria, for women, and there is where she died at a very old age. The bone gatherers, rather grisly. We have, as you know, when the martyrs were put to the sword, their bodies were left where they were slain. Enterprising and very decent, caring women felt that these saints, before they became saints, their remains needed to be collected and properly buried. Lucina was one of those. She gathered the bones of Bishop Cornelius and took his bones to a place outside of Rome on a private property. She was a wealthy woman. Those remains were found in 1849 by de Rossi, the great excavator who excavated the catacombs. Beatrix, two brothers, were slain by the Romans and their bodies were dumped into the Tiber River. She retrieved those bodies in order to provide a proper burial. Cyricia, she retrieved the bones of St. Lawrence and made sure that they had a proper burial. Now, getting into the meat of this topic this evening, apostles took women, not as wives or sisters, but took them to co-minister to reach and penetrate the inner rooms of women. No scandal could occur under this concept, and this is a comment by the doctor of the church, Clement of Alexandria. He mentions it as a major factor during his ministry. Think about for a moment, could a man go into the inner chambers of a woman in their home, perform a baptism, perform a healing? No. It would have been disastrous for that man. So, who better than to administer to women than other women? And this is very key. We miss this often when we look through the New Testament.
Now, remember, we have these two worlds, right? The outside world, violent, crazy, the world of men, and the inside world, inside the house, for women. Now, the ancient world kept these two worlds separate. They kept them very separate for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons for keeping the inside world separate was for the protection of the family, that there is absolutely no doubt whose children these are. That make sense? Because we do not want to pass on our family heritage to someone who is not our child. So the inside was a sanctuary. It's very private. Actually, it's so private, there are some scholars who believe that because the women were inside so long and so much, they only would go outside for a little bit to get water at the well and come back, but they would stay inside so much and talking amongst themselves. Some scholars believed that in the Greco-Roman world, women had, because they were only talking amongst themselves, they developed their own dialect. And that their version of Greek and Latin was actually sufficiently different enough that sometimes it was hard for the men to understand them. Can you imagine that? Can't believe that. What? Huh? I mean, this is how separate these worlds were. So you can imagine this Christian impulse to unite the two worlds is very, very remarkable. Remember in that earlier aside we said that Jesus and the church begins the process of uniting these two worlds that the ancient world had kept so different. This is one of the now we're going to show you now some of the evidence of this uniting. When we read these passages in the scripture, Philemon 2, 1 Corinthians 15:9, we go, you know what, you don't even notice it. Your eyes just go right over it. This was unbelievably revolutionary when the people first read it. This was like a nothing verse. You probably never even heard of these verses. In the ancient world, this would have been the most stunning verses you would have seen. What these verses say is, it says house church women named. Now, this is shortly after the time of Jesus, before the Catholic Church became recognized in the Roman Empire. So for several hundred years, as you know, the Christian church was relatively underground, right? So where did people go to Mass? At a house. At a house. Oh my God. We're in the home. Who runs the home? The woman, right? We're in the, now remember I said that the male is king of the outside and the woman is queen of the inside. There's no superior, inferior here. The man is superior outside, the woman is superior inside. It's very, very important to understand that. So the house church is named for the woman. And so all of these verses talk about, now you know how the epistles were written. Paul would travel around, St. Paul would travel around. He would found a church in Camarillo. And then he would found this church in Camarillo. And then he would move on. And he would go to Newbury Park. And of course, having arrived in Newbury Park, he would instantly hear from messages that everything has gone to hell in the handbasket in Camarillo. Which we would expect, right? So he would write a letter to the church in Camarillo. I've heard all about you guys. I've heard all about it. And here, this is my letter to the church in Camarillo. You know, shape up and fly right, right? And then he would move on from Newbury Park to Westlake Village, and then as soon as he got there, he would hear about how Newbury Park had fallen to hell in a handbasket, and he would write a letter to them, okay? So that's all, every one of the epistles is basically a letter acknowledging that things have gone to hell in the handbasket in that church, and he is correcting problems in Corinth and Ephesus and the church in Colossae. You know that. Well, those are the passages that we generally read in church on Sunday and at masses. But there's these other passages that you just kind of gloss over, that you just think are just kind of ancillary passages. These are the passages on the slide right now. They say, "Give my greetings to Aphia and the house church there. Give my greetings to all those wild people in Camarillo who are at the house church of Priscilla. Please send my greetings to Nympha and my gratitude that she is hosting everybody in her home." You see that? So these are all the people who were running churches. Now, that's number one. Number two, these are letters that are circulated outside. What does that mean, circulated outside? It's in the world of men. Okay? So for a woman to be named in a letter that circulates in the world of men is revolutionary. To be named in the scriptures is to be declared that you have status. You see that? The fact that these people are named never happened in the world of men. When the men wrote letters from one place to another, they just said, "Hi Bob, this is Fred, this is what I'm doing." They would never mention Mary, Karen, or Susie. So for these names to be mentioned means that Paul was acknowledging these people as equals. Do you see that? This is revolutionary. This is unheard of. This is stunning. And would have been remarkable in the ancient world. And if you want to write these verses down, you can look them up. But there's a whole bunch of them. And that last one is interesting, where in the Epistle to the Philippians, the name of Syntyche is mentioned. And Paul indicates, "They have worked hard with me to spread the gospel." This is a woman working alongside men outside to spread the gospel. This is the Christian message. This is different. This is Jesus and the church joining the two worlds in a way that had never been done before in the history of the world. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'll leave it. I'm going to tag on this one and have some fun. Chloe in the Gospels, and I'll cite having trouble with her people. So, leadership role. Little story about Priscilla. Priscilla and her husband Aquila discovered Paul teaching in a synagogue. And when he came out, they explained to him that we need to give you further instruction in ways of the Lord.
They told Paul.
And you'll find that in the New Testament. Oops, skip one. This is for you. And this is one of my favorite topics, and I believe it's Father Dave's as well. He's going to tag in on this one. Mary Magdalene, probably the most noted woman besides Mary, the mother of Jesus, second, I should say, to Mary, the mother of Jesus. She is mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels 7 times.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. In all 4 of the Synoptic Gospels. 7 being the perfect number, which Father Dave always talks about. Okay? And it's just phenomenal. Do you want to do the demons now?
Now, this is important to me because in our yearly pilgrimage to the Holy Land, we go to Magdala. You might know that a couple of years ago, actually people that I know bought some land in Magdala, and they're building a hotel structure there. And in the process of digging, they found a first-century synagogue. And this is a place that's guaranteed that Jesus walked on the synagogue in Magdala, because we know that he went there because he was connected to Mary of Magdala. That's what Mary Magdalene means. Now, Mary Magdalene, I just want to go by what the gospel says. I know that later on, you see the word Pope Gregory down there at the end. Later on in the history, sometimes Mary Magdalene was equated with being a prostitute or a woman of ill repute. Okay? The Gospels don't say that. Let me tell you what they do say, and what they say is actually worse. She was a Democrat. Just kidding. No. She was a UCLA grad. That was the Just want to make sure you're listening, that's all. No, it's actually, it's very important to understand this. And because archaeologists, we just go with the evidence. What's the text say? What do the bones say? What do the rocks say? And actually, the reason I say it's worse is this. It says that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons. Okay, very often Jesus is walking along and he encounters someone who has a demon, and he expels that demon. One demon. Person has one demon, expels it. Okay, great. Mary Magdalene had 7. 7 is a perfect number. All right? What's the perfect number in our culture? 10. 0. Right? You know, if you say something's a 10,
Oh, yeah.
right? A perfect 10. Right? That's the perfect number in our culture. Every culture has numbers that mean things. You know, if you say you're a 0, you know, or we say number 1, that means something, right? Number, you know, if you're a 10, you know, a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being best, all right? So 10 means, you know, so in our culture, 10 is the top number. In the ancient culture, in the Jewish culture, 7 was the perfect number. 3 was a good number. 6 was the worst number because it was 1 less than 7. If 3 is a good number and 6 is the worst number, what's 666? It's the perfect badness, right? It's 3, it's really good bad, right? 666, right? So that's how numbers work in the Old Testament. 7 is a good number. If you have 7 demons, that means you are perfectly bad. We have no idea what her demons were. No idea. It's improper and incorrect to say that she was a prostitute or anything like that. We have no idea. All we know is that she was perfectly bad. Now, however, why do they mention that? Because this perfectly bad person changed to become the greatest follower of Jesus. That's the reason why they mention it. You see that? This is a person who has changed. I think that is the most important message of all. It was my sermon this morning at the 8:15 Mass, that the story of Lent is, no matter what your background has been, no matter what your past has been, no one is a victim of their past. Whatever your past has been, your future can be different. What's the proof of that? Mary Magdalene. Even Mary Magdalene, 7 demons, got rid of all of them and followed Jesus. That's the meaning of Mary Magdalene. Now, not only that, but someone who had at one time had 7 demons was a witness to the resurrection, that's the cross, and that up arrow is, the witness to the crucifixion, the death, and that upward arrow is the resurrection. This is a woman outside the home. Did the crucifixion happen in the living room? Did it happen in the den? Happened outside, among Roman soldiers. And there's a woman outside giving testimony with Mary, the Mother of God, to the crucifixion and the resurrection. She's doubted by the 12. Of course she's doubted by the 12. She's a woman outside the home. So why do the Gospels put that in? Why do the Gospels write that Mary Magdalene is the witness to the crucifixion and the resurrection? Why do they put it there? Did they want to put it there? No. Why did they want to put it there? Because women belong in the home. They put it there because it happened. They had no choice. This is the last thing that they would have wanted to write, but they had to write it because it actually happened. Does that make sense? In other words, because this is so countercultural, the fact that they would write something like that in the Gospels that is meant to go out and persuade people to become Christian, they would say, gee, we wish we could write something different, but we can't because this actually happened, and we're not going to write anything that didn't actually happen. So this is actually proof positive that Mary Magdalene actually was the witness to the crucifixion, the death, and the resurrection. The fact that she was doubted by the 12, and yet made it into the gospel. It really is remarkable. So Mary Magdalene really has this remarkable, powerful force in the early church. And I just mentioned about Pope Gregory, that his sermon later on, which talked about her as being a prostitute and a woman of ill repute, wasn't really about that. It was really about someone, it was about how someone can make a huge change in their life. The purpose of Gregory's talk was metanoia, was change. You see, that you could go from this life to that life, and that the point of his talk was the tremendous, he gave the talk during Lent. The whole thing was that during Lent we can be forgiven and move on to a new and better life. And Mary Magdalene was the perfect example of that. Really, the story of Mary Magdalene is just so remarkable, and such a great, it was such a great edifying force for the early church, that this woman was not in the home, outside, giving testimony, challenging, and the first person and she was the first person to bring the news of the resurrection.
We talk about the witness factor, and doubted by the 12, that also has an historical nexus. Because in the Middle East at the time, women were not considered credible witnesses because they were outside. They'd have to be outside the home in order to be a witness. So as a consequence, there was doubt by the 12 apostles, and that was more of a cultural thing. However, if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus admonished the apostles for not believing, if you recall. This is my favorite passage from John. You'll hear it this coming Easter Sunday. It'll be the Gospel. I believe it's lectionary B. They'll do verses 1 through 9 or thereabouts. But I would like to, because it's so compelling and so powerful, because there is something very unusual going on here. So, if I may, to be accurate. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked, woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize that it was Jesus. He asked her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to Mary, she turned to him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to the Father and to your Father and to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I've seen the Lord, and she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, the important part of the passage here is Jesus is saying, do not hold on to me. He is going on to another realm. So this is a great truth that he is divulging. So that's why I find this particular passage extremely powerful, and the fact that it was divulged to Mary Magdalene. Now, another interesting piece of historical data on Mary Magdalene is that Pope John Paul, in a letter in the 1980s, called Mary Magdalene the apostle of the apostles. If I may, one more time. This was an apostolic letter from Pope John Paul in 1988 titled Mulieris Digitatum, which means on the dignity and vocation of women. The women are the first at the tomb. They are the first to find it empty. They are the first to hear he has risen, as he said. They are the first to embrace his feet and they are the first to announce this truth to the apostles. The Gospel of John emphasizes the special role of Mary Magdalene. She is the first to meet the risen Christ, and she became the first to be called the Apostle of the Apostles. Mary Magdalene was the first eyewitness of the risen Christ, and for this reason she was the first to bear witness to him before the apostles. This event, in a sense, crowns all that has been said previously about Christ, entrusting the divine truths to women as well as men. Since Easter is almost upon us, I thought I would just add this little slide. You're not familiar with the story. The Easter egg is really a symbol for the tomb for which Jesus came forth. And you'll see Mary Magdalene holding a red Easter egg in her right hand. Well, the story goes that several years, I should say, shortly after the resurrection of Christ, she journeyed to Rome and had an audience with Emperor Tiberius. And during that meeting with Emperor Tiberius, she advised him that Jesus had risen from the dead. And before she could finish that statement, Emperor Tiberius said to her, "I'll believe that, as if I believe that egg would turn red in your hand." And he didn't even complete the sentence, and the egg turned red. So we have a tradition of why Christians exchange colored Easter eggs, is because the egg is the symbol of the tomb for which Jesus came forth. Intermission, we'll take a 5-minute break.
Especially tomorrow night on Daily Life, we'll talk about just how countercultural everything Jesus did. There is nothing that Jesus did that fit in with the culture. Nothing. If you look at it this way, if you're a salesman and you want to sell something to a client, aren't you just going to like totally meld yourself to that client, and whatever that client likes, all of a sudden you like, and if that, you're just going to like totally become one with that client. And if that client likes golf, you're going to give all kinds of golf metaphors. If that client likes sports, you're going to give all kinds of sports metaphors. Well, none of that happened. In the Greco-Roman world, everything that Jesus did was completely countercultural to the Greco-Roman world. And yet, within a couple of centuries, the entire Greco-Roman world converted to Catholicism. That's extraordinary. I was telling Bob that by coincidence, just last week I had dinner with a famous church historian from Rome who was visiting friends of hers here in the area, and they invited me over to the house to meet her because she's fairly well known, and Father Dave would like to meet her. So I just asked her, I said, what do you think was the cause for, why did Romans who appreciated power and violence and all that, why did they appreciate a religion that was so different, had a hero that was crucified, whose main message was, we follow Jesus Christ, who, by the way, was horribly tortured and crucified, and said, follow him. You want to come along? How did that message work? And how did that message work that had women coming out of the house? And she said, well, that's exactly it. She said Christianity was all-inclusive. That you had a religion that would meet in a home, that would have women and men, and rich and slaves, and lepers and sick and healthy and young and old, and just every kind of person would be in this house, perhaps run by Priscilla, perhaps one run by Aquila, but everybody would be in that one house. And that never occurred in any other experience in the ancient world. And so slowly, house by house, person by person, it ended up changing the Roman world. So we have a long, long history of every single person, male and female, taking their faith seriously and going wherever it needed to go. So we're just going to talk in the next few minutes to finish our talk, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'm back. Andronicus and Junia, again from the New Testament, in Romans 16:7. Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and fellow prisoners, who are note among the apostles and were in Christ before me. Let's examine apostle. We know that the 12, they were unequal. Those that followed them, Paul, Barnabas, Timothy, second level. Third level is probably right here with Junia and Andronicus. Now what did they do after they left what is now modern-day Turkey? They went to a country or region called Pannonia, present-day Hungary, bordered by Austria, and in the south, it used to be the former Yugoslavian Republic. I'm going to say it's Croatia. I could be wrong. They founded a new church community in a totally different region. Now we're starting to expand. Look where we are. Italy, dead center, to the right. You have Mesopotamia, the Middle East. So the expansion is taking place as early as, we wouldn't know the dates on this, but it would probably be 70 AD, around there, plus or minus 5, 8. Phenomenal. Now we could also call them co-workers. They were co-spiritual. We don't know if they're married. I would guess that they were. Priscilla, she shows up also in Paul's writings. There are 7 New Testament references to her. Her name precedes Aquila 5 times, which means she is a woman of prominence more so than he. So she was performing deeds and spreading the truths, teaching the gospel, and she excelled at it. And that's probably why she was mentioned 5 times with her name first. Obviously, she was a teacher. She had to be. She was by the way, both of them were expelled from Rome, reasons unknown. See, the Bible doesn't tell us everything. But they encounter Paul in Corinth, okay? And they found another house church. They also traveled extensively with Paul, which means that Paul trusted them to accompany him with his travels and spread the word. Phenomenal. Another woman, Priscilla, named in the New Testament. Christianity, the first 400 years. We were debating whether or not we should go any further. All right, well, we stuck at 400 to make it very simple. Plus, I'm not very good with dates except my birthday, but I've forgotten that recently, so. Women and orphans. Unique phenomenon taking place in Rome in the Christian community. Christians obviously there were a lot of orphans roaming the streets of that Roman city. And what took place is that the Christian communities, women, took these children in, possibly fed them, clothed them, bathed them, tended to them when they were sick. And then they would move them on maybe to another family. You could say this is the beginning of the foster care system in Rome in the first 100 or 200 years. Isn't that phenomenal? Christians reaching out to others. Now they're on the outside reaching out, but bringing them inside to comfort them in their ship. Phenomenal.
What happened to orphans if they didn't do that? They never did.
Well, they would suffer, die from disease, die of hunger. There's another phenomenon in Roman culture, they called it exposure. Have you heard of exposure?
Just leave them out.
Pardon? No, the male had the right to deny that he had a child, and as Father Dave and I were discussing this morning, they would leave it where it lay and say, I'm not responsible for its death, it was the weather. So they called it exposure. And that was a common occurrence in all three cultures. And the Romans, in their wonderful way of thinking, thought it was a form of population control.
Just continuing on that idea, one of the dominant features of the ancient world was based on power. If you had power, you had virtue. If you were weak, you were worthless. Now, in the ancient world, and I'll say this again tomorrow night, if you happen to walk around the corner, if you're walking on the streets of Rome, taking a walk, and you walk around the corner, and you come across two people who were beating up a little kid, do you know what you would do? Join in. You would join in. Why would you take the side of a weak person? It's weak. It's a loser. It's weak. You always take the side of the winner. Take the side of the powerful. Okay? That was the ancient culture. You always take the side of the powerful and you beat up the weak. An orphan? Who gives? A malformed child? Loser. And the idea of exposure was you would take a malformed child and you would simply put them in the field and walk away. So the child would die of exposure, but the death would not be associated to you because you didn't do it. You simply walked away. The weather did it, right? So it was a way of getting rid of a child without having it be a murder, okay? So it was all about power and weakness. So a powerful person is to be admired, a weak person is to be despised. And if you came across someone who's being beat up, you would join in because you would want to ally with the weak person. Jesus comes along, ends up beat up, right? Everyone's beating him up, tortured, crown of thorns, way of the cross, scourged, crucified. But then it's announced that he is the Son of God and he rises on the third day. If the Son of God is on the cross, then we must, and if God, here's the point, if God identifies with the victim, then we can never beat up a victim. You see that? If God allies himself with the victim, then we ally ourselves with God, and we ally ourselves with victim. Now, when I told you that story about turning the corner, that sounds horrible, right? Do you know why it sounds horrible to us? That's the legacy of Christianity. The reason why you root for the underdog and that your heart goes out to the kid being beat up is precisely because of 2,000 years of Christianity. It's Christianity that reintroduced compassion into the world. You see that? This didn't exist in the ancient world, compassion. And so Christianity actually reintroduced, that had been lost through sinfulness from Adam and Eve, reintroduced the idea of compassion for the victim. Every time that you see a crucifix over here, why is it that the largest thing in any church is a guy getting beat up? Right? What's the biggest thing that you see in any church? Is a guy getting beat up. Because that engenders in your heart compassion, and courageous compassion to come to the aid of those who are in need. So what do you think happens in the Christian world? We suddenly take care of orphans. Orphans? Who could take care of orphans in the ancient world? No one, except the Christians. Now, someone came up to me during the break and said, okay, we have the male on the outside and the woman on the inside, and she's the captain on the inside, and the male's, captain on the outside, and all of a sudden the captain on the outside goes off on a war and he gets killed. Now we have a widow. What happens to her? She is SOL. She has no chance whatsoever. She is completely out of luck. She is a widow without a man. She is completely a victim of society. She will be robbed, she'll be raped, she'll be cheated, she'll be pushed around. She is completely out of luck. Until the Christians came along. And the Christians said, oh my God, here is a person in need. How do we care for her? Well, you know, she's been victimized a lot. You know, she probably is a little sensitive about men. So we're going to have women, Christian women, take care of her and rescue her and take care of her. In fact, we're going to establish an order of women called, perhaps, a list of widows. This is a controversial part in the Gospels. We're not really sure what it means in the epistles. But in 1 Timothy chapter 5, it talks about establishing a list or order of widows. And this is a group of Christian women who are called from the community, designated. What's your name? Carolyn. You like Carolyn? Everybody agree? Everybody agree with Carolyn's a good person? Anybody have anything to say bad about Carolyn? Speak now. Speak now, or forever hold your peace. All right? Okay. You know what? Everyone likes you, Carolyn. You have good standing here in this group of men and women, and you seem to be a nice person. I hope you are. You didn't go to UCLA, did you? All right. So now, and it says in 1 Timothy 5, take Carolyn's name and add her to the list of the people who are now called forward in the order of widows. I don't know if you're a widow or not. I don't mean to get into that, but you know, you are called forward, and you are now going to be tasked by this Christian community to look out into the community and find women who are widows and take care of them. And you, Carolyn, you will attend the sick. You will care for orphans. Again, the weak. You will wash the feet of the saints, and you will pray for the church community. Are you willing to do that? Is that right? Okay. Your pay is the same as it was yesterday. Actually, believe it or not, they were paid. They were paid. It's actually written in the Gospels there, and it says that they will be paid for this, you know, a stipend, right, for their services. This is really remarkable, all right, because these are people that no one else took care of. Now, just to take another minute, Bob, if I could, there's an interesting side note to this whole idea of taking care of orphans and widows and the sick, because the Romans did not. Now, if a Roman family had a grandmother living in the house, and the grandmother got sick, okay, now the grandmother has now officially entered the category of weak. She's weak. And she's sick. Oh my God, what the hell is that about? We don't know what that's about. She's got some kind of a weird thing going on. She's got weird stuff coming out of her ears. She's got blood coming out. She's sick, you know. So they just basically left her alone. Don't go near grandma. She's got weird things going on. So what happened to grandma? She died. What did the Christians do? Oh my God, grandma's got weird things going on. She's got stuff coming out of her ears. She's got blood coming out of her nose. She's got weird things going on. Oh my God, we don't know what's going on. The same exact phrases. They're ancient world people. They're still the same citizens. But then they would say, you know what though? She's grandma, and we love her. We have no idea what's going on with her, but she's not going anywhere, and we're going to take care of her. That's what the Christians said, because that's grandma, and we love grandma. So they would feed her, and they would talk to her, and they would give her water. And you know what? Statistically, you know, X number percentage of people like that are going to get better, right? Because they felt cared for. Now, what do the Romans think? The Romans go, how come the Christian grandmothers live? Our grandmothers all died, and these Christian grandmothers live. Okay, well, it just happens to be, statistically, this is not magic. This is just American Medical Association. If you take care of someone, they're probably going to take, some percentage of them is going to live. And the Romans mistakenly thought it was magic. And they go, oh, these Romans, my God, their Christian grandmothers live and ours die. They must have got something. And actually, that actual act of compassion for Christian sick people got the attention of the secular Roman world and said, and that's when they came up with that phrase, see these Christians, how they love one another. Because their people live and our people die. And this order of widows is fascinating. I tend to think, I think along with Bob, that we both kind of agree that this was probably a special order of widows, that they were actually called out to be a special society of people who were tasked, like Carolyn, because they were good people and well respected and everything. You see the criteria listed there in 1 Timothy. There's a criteria, and you'll see Carolyn's name mentioned there. That these people are called out to be special people who take care of people.
They're not actually widows, they are taking care of widows, because it's
Oh,
opposite
no,
of way.
these are widows taking care of widows.
Oh, it's widows taking care of
Yeah,
widows.
these
Oh,
are
that
widows
makes more sense.
taking care of widows,
I got it.
okay? Now, is this a separate order or simply a description of good Christian behavior? It's ambiguous, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. I tend to think it's a separate order, okay? Not like priesthood, but a special ministry, like communion ministers, ministers to the sick, you know, that kind of thing. Now we have the word diakonos. In Paul, Romans 16:7, it says, please give my greetings to Phoebe, to Deaconess Phoebe. Okay? Now, diakonos is the Greek word for helper or servant. Here's the ambiguity that surrounds this issue. Are any of you aware of this issue? A few people. Here's the issue with that. You might know that when the scriptures that we have, and really it's amazing people could read these things, but if you imagine an 8.5 by 11 page in 2 columns, written in Greek sentences on both sides in 2 columns. However, the sentences are run-on sentences. There are no spaces between the words. There are no paragraphs. And here's the key. All of the letters are exactly the same height. So there's no capitalized letter at the beginning of a sentence. You know, so every single letter, it's basically just rows of letters back and forth. There's no distinction between paragraphs, sentences, words, or anything. It's just letters, okay? So you have the word diakonos Phoebe, okay? Now, diakonos means servant or helper. Now that's later translated into English, okay? Some Bibles, the word diakonos is not translated into English. It's simply kept in the Greek word. So you have, give my greetings to diakono Phoebe. Why is that word not translated? Why doesn't it not say, give my greetings to servant Phoebe? If you keep the Greek, it sounds like a title, right? Deacon or deaconess Phoebe. So the question is the word deacon an adjective or a noun? There's absolutely no way of knowing. It could be one or the other. For those who say that there were deacons in the early church, they will say, it's the second line, the servant, capitalized, Phoebe. If those that will say it's a adjective, they will say it's lowercase, Phoebe. Good people are on both sides of that issue. It's just very, very difficult to tell. It's just hard to say. Certainly, what we can say is, again, because the word Phoebe is named, Phoebe is an honored, treasured, respected exalted person. Was she a servant Phoebe or a titled servant Phoebe? It's just very, very difficult to say, and beyond the scope of our ability tonight to decipher. But this is what Bob and I wanted to show you was what the parameters of the debate are. Does that make sense?
What about in Aramaic? What was it then?
In Aramaic, it doesn't matter because the writings that we have are in Greek. Aramaic was the spoken language, and these passages are in Greek. There's no audio recordings.
I'm not a linguist, but let me just say this. The translations are numerous. You could go to Greek, to Syriac, to Latin, and then to English. Think about the problems with all of that. With material that denigrates before your eyes, there is always parts of parchment, and that's one of the problems. So it's extremely difficult to discern, and then we're 2,000 years later, we're second guessing. Okay. All right. We're almost done, and I always have a problem with his name. John Chrysostom, the second baptismal instruction. It covered instructions in the liturgy, church history, and doctrine. When you were baptized, way back then, it took anywhere from 1 to 3 years. It was a very long process, not like today. Well, the catechumens, they have to go through a whole process, but the infants are just brought to the church and baptized. There was a test for sincerity. You were taught, usually by a servant. There were exorcisms. You had a sponsor. Your sponsors must be Christian, just like it is today. You renounced sin, just like you do today. You were anointed with chrism. You were stripped naked if you were both male and female. You were immersed, full body immersion, as opposed to what we do today. And then following that, you were given the blessing, and then you met the members of your church community, usually with a kiss. Now, the servant or servant role in baptism. And I guess the best thing to do for me is to read again, because I don't want you to miss anything. Obviously, we had the preparatory ritual. We had the examination of faith. And here's where the key comes in with the next 3 items. And I think you'll see what point I'm trying to make. The bishop would enter the baptistry and bless the water in the font and the oil. Baptism would commence with the men first, then the women. The officiating bishop would stand at the entrance of the baptistry and anoint the female catechumen with the sign of the cross on the forehead and pray. The catechumen was then taken into the baptistry by the servant, stripped of all her clothes, her hair was loosened. The servant would then pour oil from a jar into a phial. She would pour the oil in her right hand and anoint the naked catechumen over her entire body. Now, who would you expect to do that? It served an extremely important function because during the time, modesty, if you couldn't speak to a man in public without being accused of being an adulterer, can you imagine this? How far would the apostles have gotten? Okay? The woman deacon would then take the catechumen into the font for immersion while baptismal prayers were spoken by the bishop, who was behind a curtain in the baptistry. The female deacon would then lead the newly baptized woman from the font, dry her hair, comb it, dress her in white robes, and say, "The handmaid is clothed with the garment and the righteousness in the name of the Father," etc. At the conclusion, the newly baptized were brought into the church and welcomed by the church community. So you can see they had a very important role because they were charged with doing it. Now, if you look back and say servant or servant, you could argue either way, as Father Dave said. But how many of you are hearing this for the first time? All right. Women leaderships in baptism declined over the years. Let's talk about why. We migrated to infant baptisms. More and more adults weren't being baptized, as you can imagine. Okay? Total immersion was being replaced by the pouring, okay, of the oil, and anointing of only the head and the hands instead of the entire body. But that didn't mean that other things disappeared, as you'll see in the next and final slide, which is our conclusion. Women in the early church, you would have to agree, were a major force. We find it in the Gospels. We find it in the historical record. We know there were martyrs who were giving their lives for their faith. By the way, I want you to think about, as we go through these, what are women doing today? Look at some of the parallels. Okay? Assisted with baptisms, cared for the sick, aged, poor, and orphans. Don't we have ministries that do that? Taught and preached. Converted non-believers. Devotion to prayer. My mother was a member of the Rosary Society, where they would meet a couple of times a week to pray for the sick of the parish. They anointed sick women, actually going to the homes, because again, a man couldn't enter the private world of a woman. They maintained the church. That sounds a little familiar, don't you? The sacristans today? Okay? Established convents and monasteries. We still have them today. That's big. Very big. Women were big, not only in the New Testament, when we named them, Chloe and the rest, Priscilla, Phoebe. It's just, in my opinion, they created a force within the church that made it possible for it to succeed. And with that, we'll end the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just, well, ask Father Dave, I think it's important. We've had quite a few Bible quotes here and passages from the Bible. If you're interested in doing Bible search, it's BibleSearch.com. You can look up any passage from chapter and verse, New Testament, Old Testament. You could do a search on words, so you could type in Mary Magdalene. It'll give you all the passages that Mary Magdalene appears in the Bible. You can do it by different versions of the Bibles, the American Standard, the New International, Dore Reims, and the like. And you can, actually, I would suggest that you take the one on Junia, the Apostle, and do a search on that, and then compare different versions of the Bible.